to beat the enemy at his own game, mountain and jungle warfare. Man-made weapons would exact casualties, but losses even heavier were inflicted by malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, and a wide range of tropical diseases. For the men who fought, Japanese metal could hit as hard, sickness could be as crippling as in any other theater. For them, Burma was no sideshow. Another problem was the treatment of casualties from enemy gunfire. Wounded men were sometimes carried miles by foot, by raft, mule, jeep, truck, ox cart. One of the great heroes of this campaign was Colonel Gordon Seagrave, formerly an American medical missionary who was with Stilwell on his retreat from Burma and went back to that country with a group of nurses of various native races and a series of mobile hospital units. Seagrave and his men and women performed operations under the most primitive conditions. The conquest of disease made huge strides. Now, the conquest of the Japanese had to keep pace. More and more Chinese were being trained at Rangar in India and at Kunming in China. These were to become part of the forces that were to strike at the enemy from the China-Burma border across the Salween River. In northern India, the Chinese-American Composite Wing had been organized by Major General Claire Chennault for the Generalissimo. A picked group of American volunteers was instructing Chinese pilots and crews to fly the latest type of planes. Cargo planes shuttled back and forth over the hump to China. Advance troops in the Lido Road Drive were supplied in the air by the Troop Carrier Command. Supplies were carefully packed according to weight, size, and breakability. Then they were loaded on planes with parachutes attached. Now, to find the men hidden in the jungles who needed these supplies. In twisting mile-deep canyons and jungle-covered terrain, a miss by a few yards could be as bad as missing by a few hundred miles. The Allied Air Force of British and Americans in the newly formed Eastern Air Command bombed and strafed Japanese strongholds. In India and in China, huge air bases were being built for a new and powerful weapon, the B-29 Super Fortress. Thousands of Asiatic laborers, men, women, and children, used whatever tools they could find, no matter how primitive. Seemingly everywhere was lean, raw-boned Uncle Joe, as he was referred to generally. Bluntness had also earned him the title Vinegar Joe. Doubtless there were saltier names coined in the ranks. General Stilwell would not have cared what they called him, as long as they did their job. Stilwell was truly a soldier's soldier. He shared the hardships and dangers of his men and gave the phrase real meaning. Stillwell had the unique capacity for commanding respect and obedience while evoking a genuine affection. Perhaps no group regarded the general and the man with warmer feelings than did the Chinese troops in his command. It was no secret that General Su, as he was called, had consistently extolled their courage and promoted their welfare, often in the face of adverse opinion from above. Repaying that faith now were unbroken Chinese victories in the field. Elsewhere in southern Burma, names like the Salween and Irrawaddy rivers were back in the news. But now these were scenes of successes. It was the enemy who yielded, as British-led Allied forces reclaimed more and more of Burma's soil. North and south, it was the same story. An old humiliation was being erased. It was now 2 years since the retreat from Burma, and the 61-year-old general could see his timetable for victory working out on schedule. Under the circumstances, a birthday celebration was a pleasant and well-earned respite. The presence of a son, Colonel Joseph Stilwell, Jr., marked it a family occasion as well. But however welcome, such respites must be few and far between. The forgotten war in both South and North had reached its climax. The Japanese knew well that each mile of ground lost in northern Burma meant another mile added to the link between India and China. The Lido Road was growing. On the heels of combat troops, often under Japanese harassment, came the men who must hack out that road. The land itself fought back. Jungle growth would completely reclaim and obliterate in 2 weeks' time the work that neither the Japanese nor disease nor climate would halt. Against the Japanese, there was the rifle always close by. To fight the soil, every weapon from the axe to explosive charge was employed. The work went on. General Joseph Stilwell was almost literally dragging his road behind him. Yet, as he pushed on, and the Japanese grudgingly yielded, the mule trail became a road. In relative safety, engineering could expand the road into a solid truck route. As it neared completion, the derisive phrase, "impossible road," was heard less often. Across jungle-covered plateaus it stretched, across rivers untamed since the creation, yet now they have been harnessed and bridged. Across mountain ranges it traveled to narrow the gap between India and China. Then inevitably came the great day, the day when a first convoy could move along its 1,044-mile length. The enemy had been pushed out of northeast Burma, and the way lay clear. Considering the difficulties and the hardships that had been borne in shaping its tortuous route, it was truly a military miracle that it was built. The Lido Road was now a reality. The first convoy rolled into Kunming, a token of the supply flow to follow. Honoring the man who had weathered all opposition to build the route, it was renamed the Stilwell Road. 4 months later, Allied command could announce victory in Burma. What of the man who had built the road and forged that victory? The tides and cross-currents of events had taken him far from what would have been his hour of triumph. Receiving his 4th star, General Stilwell came home to serve as commander of ground forces. Then, after the Pacific, for a tour of battlefronts and installations. In the course of those next months, he became commander of the 10th Army. Later, he was to serve as commanding general at Okinawa. But wherever the assignment, the Stilwell story remained unchanged. He was still blunt, unassuming Uncle Joe. The general with no patience for pomposity and pretense. He was still the gaunt, typical American who somehow reminded of the symbolic figure Uncle Sam. More important, he was still the Joseph Stilwell with an understanding of the men in the ranks and a talent for winning their affection. It was, of course, his own feelings being reflected, as warm feelings always are. Summer of 1945 was ending, and so too World War II. Like MacArthur, who had vowed to return to the scene of an earlier defeat and erase its humiliation, General Stilwell would welcome the date September the 2nd. Aboard the battleship Missouri, on that day, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur submitted the formal surrender terms to a defeated enemy. An end had come to the agonies of a tortured world. Peace had come, in victory and with honor. Once again for General Stilwell, there was assignment to the Presidio, but now as a prelude to well-earned retirement. At nearby Carmel was his family and the home he loved. Here he had planned to pass the rich remaining years that lay ahead. But that was not to be. On October 12th, 1946, after a short illness, stout-hearted Joseph Stilwell died. By his own instructions, any pompous ceremony was omitted. His ashes were strewn out on the Pacific, in an area he knew well and loved. At West Point, one can still find Stilwell's old campaign hat and combat boots. There hangs, too, a portrait that pays tribute to Joseph W. Stilwell's career of service to his country, to the men he led, and to the example of leadership that he gave America. He was, indeed, one of the great generals of World War II. In 1942, he stepped forth, like some warrior of old, to lead and inspire vast forces of men in North Africa and Sicily. At a pace never equaled, his Third Army swept across the continent of Europe. No American leader was more colorful and more successful. General George S. Patton, Jr., dedicated to glory and to victory, one of the great generals of American history. From his earliest years, this lad believed he was going to be General George S. Patton, Jr. His imagination was stirred by stories of great heroes of the past, told by his father. His military career began at Virginia Military Institute. At West Point, he proved himself a model cadet and an early leader among his peers. He established the first football team for soldiers, an action that would grow into a powerhouse of national champions and long-standing tradition. World War I. Convinced that this ponderous vehicle would someday come into its own, he studied it, rode into battle on it, became a hero alongside it. Our first tank commander, he would always be linked with the weapon that symbolized his driving, overwhelming personality. After the war, the tank school at Fort Meade. Two officers here shared a deep military interest, Ike Eisenhower and George Patton. The fierce expression, his getup at masquerades reflected some deep instinct to play the role of warrior or fighter. His wife joined in, sensing that even in fun, these roles suited her soldier husband. The time came, as it had before, when the clothing of battle was to be worn by millions of Americans. Two Axis spearheads were headed east. In the north, von Bock was pursuing his way through the Ukraine to the Caucasus. In the south, Rommel was driving toward the Egyptian border. These two spearheads were intended to meet in Iran and head eastward toward India. In the Orient, Japan had occupied the coast of China, the East Indies, Malaysia, and Burma in the preparation for the drive westward through India. If these two enemy spearheads were allowed to meet, Russia and China, except for their remote Arctic ports, would be completely isolated. Japanese raw materials and German production would be combined. The peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa, 7/8 of the world's population, would be enslaved. By morning, a decision, both bold and revolutionary. Bold because in this our darkest hour, we dared to take the offensive. Revolutionary because that offensive was conceived, planned, and executed by the peoples of two nations. The time and the place had been agreed upon. North Africa. Code name for the combined operation was Acrobat. Why North Africa? What was the plan called Acrobat? The convoy from America was heading east, the one from Britain heading south. At a given point west of Gibraltar, the British convoy would divide. For 12 hours, the two halves would proceed in opposite directions. Then the second half would reverse its course and follow the first, passing Gibraltar 24 hours behind. Thus, with clock-like precision, the combined operations would begin simultaneous landings at Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. Casablanca to protect our flank against an Axis attack through Spanish Morocco. Oran and Algiers to secure bases from which to press eastward. Then, the occupation of Tunisia, from which we could cut Rommel's supply lines across the Mediterranean. Next, trap and destroy Rommel's Africa Corps between our Allied forces and the British Eighth Army. Thus, one arm of the Axis pincer would be amputated, and supply lines around the Cape of Good Hope would be shortened by half through winning control of the Mediterranean. North Africa would be under Allied control, with bases from which to stab at the heart of the Axis citadel. Those were the main objectives of the plan called Acrobat. In both convoys, the men kept fit, now knowing the task that lay ahead. For most of them, this voyage would be a new experience. They'd never been so far from home before. In command of American forces for the invasion of North Africa, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. The enemy knew nothing until the last possible moment, when the first half of the convoy from Britain steamed past the fortress of Gibraltar. It was at night that the ships passed through the straits. The time had been carefully chosen, for here in narrow waters, attack seemed certain. Aboard ship and on the rock, everyone stood to, but the ships moved steadily on. It was as though, for the moment, the enemy's sword had fallen from his hand through indecision. This time, it was in Rome and in Berlin that the lights burned all night. For the first time since the war's beginning, somebody else was calling the tune. Before the enemy could collect its wits and its forces, our ships lay as planned off their appointed destination. Events planned 4 months earlier moved to a climax. Off Casablanca stood the convoy from America. General Patton spoke to the troops aboard ship.
Soldiers and sailors, it is not known whether the French African army will contest our landing, but all resistance, by whomever offered, must be destroyed. However, when any of the French soldiers seek to surrender, you will accept it and treat them with the respect due a brave opponent and future ally. Remember, the French are not Nazis or Japs.
November the 8th, 1942. Orders of the day. The words, "play ball," transmitted by the task force commander, signifies that all forces are to take vigorous and offensive action against the enemy. A large searchlight shown in a vertical position at night signifies that the enemy has agreed to the terms of the Allies. With the words, "play ball," the fight was on in Casablanca. Meanwhile, in Algiers, our landing craft also met fire from shore batteries, which was soon silenced by ships of the British Navy. Here, too, the French troops ashore were asked by radio to indicate a friendly attitude by throwing their searchlight beams vertical. It wasn't long before, here and there along the coast, searchlights were seen pointing to the heavens. As dawn broke, Fighter planes from Gibraltar, fitted with extra fuel tanks, took off without even waiting to hear whether the landing fields at Algiers had been captured. By 7 a.m., resistance at Algiers was finished. British and American troops had landed east and west of the city, penetrated the area, and held the heights from all vantage points. In Algiers on that famous November the 8th was Admiral Jean Delon, French Vice Chief of State under Marshal Pétain. It was after consultation with him that the French commanding general agreed to surrender the city. In Oran, American paratroops and airborne infantry flown from Britain 1,500 miles away had landed to capture airfields, while other American troops had poured ashore on the beaches protected by the British Navy. Here, as in Algiers, the fighting lasted for only a few hours. But at Casablanca, the battle still raged. Shore batteries and the heavy guns of the French battleship Jean d'Arc and several cruisers, destroyers, and gunboats put out a devastating pile. Gunnery from American ships, coupled with precision bombing, silenced those guns. Striking north and south of the city, shock troops cut the railways, other lines of communication, then converged upon the town. Two days later, the Germans invaded unoccupied France, whereupon Admiral Delon, declaring Pétain a prisoner of the Axis and himself the chief of state, ordered the cessation of hostilities. In proof of the surprise of our landings, German armistice commissions were caught flat-footed in each city. Their jobs? To bleed North Africa of her raw materials and farm products. The people of North Africa were evidently not sorry to see them go. One of the outstanding features of this campaign was Patton's bold leadership and the impression he left on French and Arabs alike. Long-range plans could now be discussed, plans which would cast America's toughest general in a leading role. Meanwhile, a battle was raging to the east in Tunisia. His tankers, whom he roused to a pitch of fighting spirit, joined the fighting. Allied leaders sensed Patton's remarkable military gifts his judgment, his sure instinct for what the enemy would do. Patton set a tank trap for Rommel. Rommel marched right into it. His 10th Panzer Division lost half its 60 tanks, retired, and never attempted a counterattack. The Americans blitzed their way into Bizerte. The British smashed right through the center to capture Tunis. Then a British armored column crashed across the neck of the cape to Hammamet. Another British column raced around the tip of the cape to prevent any evacuation. The whole Axis mass was split into 4 segments. The end came quickly. By tens, by hundreds, by thousands they came. On foot, in trucks and behind their bands. The greatest mass surrender of fully equipped troops in modern history. Allied losses totaled nearly 70,000 men, dead, wounded, and missing. 35,000 British, 18,000 Americans, 15,000 French. But for every man the Allies had lost, the Germans had lost 5. And at the end, 15 full divisions, 266,000 of Germany's best men laid down their arms. With this victory came the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. His reputation grew. He looked forward eagerly to his next campaign. He'd been selected to command a new army, the 7th, slated for the conquest of Sicily. An order of the day from Patton to his men. Remember that we as attackers have the initiative. We must retain this tremendous advantage by always attacking, rapidly, ruthlessly, viciously, without rest. Keep punching. God is with us. We shall win. Attack. Attack. And when in doubt, attack again. Patton's major principle for fighting battles or a war. His chief mission, he believed, was to arouse the morale of his men. He urged them on, certain that speed and boldness could shorten the war. Like British General Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty, he believed in showmanship. But he was aware that if the act could not be carried off in fine style, the men would see through it. Both leaders used every means to inspire the troops of their vast command. Sicily proved to be a model campaign. Sound tactics and a fighting spirit won the island in just 38 days. The Supreme Allied commander paid a visit. Passionately involved in the work at hand, Patton had acquired a reputation for being tempestuous, sometimes rash. There was a question as to his role in the invasion of Europe. Then, his whereabouts carefully concealed from the German high command, he appeared